So in case you're curious about my company, we are a private limited company that's fully funded by the government. Okay, so if that's confusing enough, next I'm going to talk to you about something even more confusing. Okay, first some disclaimer, right? Two things. Everything I'm about to say is represented by myself, not by my company, not by anybody or anything else. Okay. Number two, please do not implement anything that I say before you're doing your own homework, because yeah, you know your network better than me. Okay. So some acknowledgements first. A lot of the heavy lifting has been done by a lot of people here listed here. There's actually many others. So most of the research has been is from the first link at the top from Ilaj Shamir. So it was released somewhere in January. You can read it up. It's all this. I will share a link to the slides at the end. Yeah. So don't need to take too many photos. Okay. So before we talk about Kerberos delegation, we have to first understand what is Kerberos. Just a quick show of hands. Anybody already knows what I'm going to talk about? All right, very good. So, what, 2%, right? Okay, what's Kerberos authentication, right? So, if you go and Google what is Kerberos, you'll end up with this kind of images and flowcharts and all sorts of funny things, right? So, it's not very easy to understand. It can be quite intimidating, and you wouldn't want to study this unless you have some very strong motivation. So, I'll summarize for you in one slide. What is Kerberos? It's an authentication protocol. Right? It doesn't use, it doesn't store passwords locally. It uses tickets, right? The concept of tickets. So there's this guy called a KDC, Key Distribution Center. There's also a ticket granting server, a TGS. So typically they are in the domain controller as the same system. Some background, you should understand what is Active Directory first. Okay. So there are services involved. So services are identified by this thing called service principal names, SPNs. And everything in Kerberos is encrypted, built on symmetric key cryptography. So one of the best diagrams that I found here is from SANS. Yeah, from SANS. So you got a very simple diagram here. So there's a user there that wants to access a host on the bottom. So the first step the user does is do an authentication service request to the KDC, and then the KDC will give back a thing called a TGT, a ticket granting ticket. So that confirms who you are. So now the user wants to access the service. He uses that TGT to give it back to the TGS, right? TGS sends a request and gets a response for the service ticket, and then use that service ticket to access the service. So if you're wondering what planet I'm from, so I will rephrase that in a simple English now. So here we got three simple entities, Alice, the security counter, and Bob, the property agent. So we have a scenario here. Now Alice wants to buy a property from a real estate company. I think since we're in Singapore, I'll talk about HDB because it's quite a good example. So in HDB, you can buy property from HDB. You can also take a loan from HDB, right? So now Alice is in the HDB office. She has an appointment with Bob, property agent. So she goes to the security counter, right? She verifies her identity with the security counter. That's the KDC. Security counter gives her a visitor pass. So that's the TGT, right? So now she wants to meet the property agent. She brings the visitor pass back to the security counter. And then the security counter will give her a blue envelope. So that's the service ticket, right? So with that service ticket, she can access the property agent or meet Bob, the property agent. So that you can see there's a parallel here. So assuming that this HDB uses Kerberos, which is obviously a very noisy protocol. So along the years, there's been some attacks, very well-known Kerberos attacks. So a couple of years already. So again, one of the best diagrams here is from SANS. I'm not going to read everything here. But here's a good summary. I'll just summarize for you everything. So there's this thing called overpass the hash, right? So when your password or your hash is stolen, you can use it to create TGT. There's also Kerberos thing. So you can request a service ticket and crack it offline. Anybody can do this, unprivileged users. There's pass the ticket. So if you steal somebody's TGT, you can impersonate that person already. And then if you forge a service ticket, that's called a silver ticket attack. And if you can forge a TGT, that's called a golden ticket attack. Right? So now let's talk about Kerberos delegation. Why do you even need this? So along the way, there were some requirements for a service to access another service on behalf of a user. So if you look at this diagram here, there's a front end and a back end server. So the front end server basically needs to access the back end server on behalf of the user. So that's Kerberos delegation. I'll repeat again. So just think of it as a front end and a back end, right? The front end needs to access the back end on behalf of the user. So along the way, again, there's a few flavors of Kerberos delegation introduced over the years. In fact, it's been around since Windows Server 2000. right? So the first was called unconstrained delegation, and then there was traditional constrained delegation released in Server 2003, and then the most recent one was in Server 2012. It's called resource-based delegation. So I'll go through this in detail. So the key to remember here is that for unconstrained and traditional constrained delegation, right, is configured on the front end, right? And then for resource-based, it's configured on the back end. And then for constrained delegation, right, there was these two new extensions that were introduced called S4U to self over here, S4U to self and S4U to proxy. And these are always run on the front end. So remember that, it's always on the front end. Okay, then there's also this tool, I'm just going to lightly touch on this. There's this tool called KQ by the same creator of Mimikatz. So a lot of people don't really know about it because, well, it's not really well documented in the first place. So he's always, the guy who created Mimikatz is always hinting around, you know, if you dislike Mimikatz, wait for KQ and so on. So late last year, there was another guy called Will Schroeder. He created a tool called Rubius, right? Rubius is based off KQ. So later I have some demos that I'll show that's based on Rubius. So what is unconstrained delegation? So first of the three, right? So it's based on this flag called trusted for delegation, right? So I'll show you. So we come back to our scenario here. So again, I mentioned it was introduced in Windows Server 2000. So the function is actually still available today for backward compatibility, as always from Microsoft, right? So how it works is that it keeps a copy. So if, let's say, if Bob now needs to access Alice's data from the finance department, right? Bob keeps a copy of the visitor pass. I'll show you, which is the TGT. Okay, so first we have an assumption here. So Bob needs to check Alice's finance history from finance, because HDB also you can take a loan from finance, right? From themselves. Oops. So the first 5 steps are the same as before. So Alice has authenticated with the KDC. She is who she says she is. She has a TGT, right? So she's got a visitor pass. Now, Bob tells security, look, I need to check Alice's finance history before she can take a loan. I need to check it from a finance department. So Bob, what Bob does is that he uses his Alice's visitor pass, right? I have a visitor pass. Can you please give me another pass to go to the finance department? So security put Alice's identity into a pink envelope that only finance can open and gives it to Bob. All right, so now Bob can use that pink envelope to access the finance department. I hope you can follow me here. So at first, Alice has a blue envelope to access Bob, right? So now Bob uses Alice's TGT with a visitor pass to get a pink envelope to access finance department. So that sounds good, right? Sounds pretty straightforward. But what happens now if that server was compromised? So let's come back to reality now, right? Web server is the unconstrained delegation server. File server is the back-end server. So web server is the front end, file server is the back end. So if web server becomes compromised, what happens? An adversary could retrieve all the stored TGTs because Bob keeps a copy of all the visitor passes. It's retrieve the TGTs stored in web server and use it in a pass the ticket attack. So can you imagine what if the domain admin was coerced to somehow authenticate with the web server? So pass the ticket can be done with the domain admin TGT. So what's worse was last year in October 2018, a guy called Lee Christensen, right? He shared that if the Prince Spooler service was running, you can force that computer's credential to be sent to the unconstrained delegation server, and this is called the printer bug. It's an old printing protocol used internally by Microsoft. And so what's worse is that the Prince Spooler service is running by default on all Windows servers, including domain controllers, right? So it was actually even possible to compromise one DC. If you compromise one DC domain controller, you can compromise another domain controller as well by abusing the trust. So this was only patched in July, very recent. And this patch will actually force the unconstrained delegation relationships to not work anymore. You could actually break quite configurations. Okay, so I got the first demo here. So what I want to illustrate to you is that if an unconstrained delegation server is compromised, it's equivalent to gaining domain admin rights. Okay, so I've configured the web server to unconstrained delegation. So here we can check. This is how you can check that the web server is configured. Okay, so now when the web server, can I pause this? So we got two consoles, right? On the right side, we're going to run the printer bug. On the left side, we're going to capture the credentials of the DC. Okay, so I'll first try to do a DC sync. I hope you know what's DC sync, yeah? Sorry if you don't. Okay, it's obviously not going to work. So I'll purge all the tickets. So now we're going to use Rubius to listen for a connection from the domain controller. And now we run the printer bug on the right side. You can see it says it probably worked, and it will work because it's a video. So that's the ticket right there. So that's the domain controller ticket that you can use to access, do a DC sync. So you can see how it's being done here. You can use Rubius again to inject the ticket into memory. Imported already. And now you can do a DC sync. So once you have this KRB TGT ticket, you can do a golden ticket attack. That's it. Yeah, forging a TGT to impersonate anybody in the domain with any privileges you want. Of course, it's detectable. Okay, so we move on to traditional constraint delegation. So Microsoft introduced this in 2003, Server 2003. So it included two new extensions called this S4U to proxy and S4U to self. So let's look at the first one, S4U to proxy. So now, Bob, obviously there are some problems with the earlier setup, so Bob is no longer allowed to keep the visitor passes. So now Bob is now given a property called MS allowed to delegate to property, which lists the only other departments that he can access Alice's identity on behalf of. Previously, he could just access any other department that he wanted to. So the first 5 steps are the same as before. So now Bob wants to access finance department using Alice's identity, right? So he checks his property. So basically think of it as a list, right? It's just a simple list of SPNs that he can access to. So he checks if finance is listed in his list, right? He can get more info on behalf of Alice. So he brings Alice's blue envelope now instead of the visitor pass. He uses the blue envelope, brings it to security and says, hey, I need to access Alice's identity, info at finance. So security puts Alice's identity in a pink envelope, and the rest again is the same. Once you have the pink envelope, you can access finance's history, right? Alice's history. So same concept. If you have instead of exchanging the visitor pass, right, you exchange the blue envelope instead. So again, the blue envelope is the service ticket. So think of it as S4U to proxy. S4U to proxy is basically exchanging one service ticket for another. Okay, so this is all like a recipe for disaster. You just hear me out. S4U to proxy is exchanging one service ticket for another. And then the other extension is called S4U to self. It's enabled in this flag called trusted auth for delegation. So what happens now if Alice meets Bob outside the office? So she won't have a visitor pass, right? So without a visitor pass, she cannot exchange it for a blue envelope. So what Bob can do is he can go to security and say, hey, Alice needs a blue envelope. Why don't you give it to her instead? And that's called S4U to self. So once you have the blue envelope, you can exchange for the pink envelope. Pink envelope, you can access finance department. So the thing you just need to remember is that S4U to self allows you to create service tickets out of thin air. All right, so you got 2 recipe ingredients, right? You can create a recipe, create a service ticket, and you can use that service ticket to exchange for another service ticket. And so with these 2 rights, you can also add the services that you want to access. So if you added an LDAP service on the domain controller, you can do a DC sync. So like what I said, S4U to self, you can create a service ticket for anyone. You can print service tickets out of thin air. And then you can use S4U to proxy to exchange it for another service ticket. So imagine if you create a ticket for administrator, for one service, you can use that administrator ticket and exchange it for another administrator ticket to another service. So that's the danger of these 2 protocols. So Microsoft recognized this during the design phase, thankfully, right? So, and they configured this property called, a right called SE enable delegation privilege to modify all this. And by default, only domain and enterprise admins have this. So no other people should have this. If they do, it could possibly already gain domain admin rights. So moving on, we have resource-based delegation. So along the ways, delegation became quite painful. So we had articles like this from a website. It says, how Server 2012 eases the pain of Kerberos constraint delegation, part 1. I don't know how many parts are there. So apparently it was quite painful, and SPNs were very hard to manage. You had to every SPN had to be unique, And in a large enterprise, you had easily thousands of SPNs to manage. And worse still, you had to involve the domain administrator to configure delegation all the time. So it was considered as troublesome. So a new concept was introduced called resource-based delegation. So instead of configuring the delegation on the front end, now you configure it on the back end, which is the resource. That's the principle of it. So I'll recap again. I'm going to have a comparison of table now. Right? Traditional constraint configured on the front end, which is the web server. Right? You need you need to have that list called allowed to delegate to, which defines which services you can delegate to. S4U to self is only possible if that flag trusted to off for delegation is set, and you require domain admin to configure delegation. And then on the back end, the file server won't even know who's accessing it on behalf of anybody else. Right? So that's the list that's configured on the front end, and that's the delegation relationship. So in Server 2012, resource-based constraint delegation, the flag is not used. Allowed to delegate to is not used, right? And the big change here, S4U to self, which is what? Creating tickets out of thin air, right? Is possible even if trusted to off is not set. Big change, right? So initially you need a flag to be set. Now you don't even need a flag to be set to print tickets out of thin air. And then on the back end, the file server is configured on the file server, like I said, and you don't even need domain admin rights anymore. You just need a thing called writable DECL to the file server, the back end. So the big difference is that it's on the back end. Now I mentioned about discretional access control list DECL. I hope you're again a bit of context required. So what is it? I'll just very briefly mention again. A few years ago there was this article called "An Ace Up the Sleeve." So it basically talks about misconfigurations that could lead to privilege escalation by abusing DECLs. So in essence, what is it? So all AD control objects are controlled by these things called control rights. Right? So all AD objects, computer objects and user objects. So if you could have if you could modify a computer object, that means you would have these control rights such as generic write DECL, and write owner. So if you have these control rights let's say if you have these rights, it basically means you can do a few things, right? So in this article, it actually says that if you have writable permissions to a user object, you could change the password. You could also do targeted Kerberos roasting, which is basically adding an SPN to a service or user and then forcing the service ticket to come back to you and cracking it offline. Sorry, if you don't have any, if you haven't heard of this before, it's probably quite overwhelming. And then if you if you use Bloodhound, so Bloodhound is a tool where you could actually visualize all your AD weaknesses. You could actually come up with attack vectors like this, so you can force somebody to change their password without them knowing. Then maybe you do it at night. Then you use that password to gain access to another service. They end up with domain control rights, domain administrator rights, and then change back the user's password. So this is a very realistic scenario actually. And if you had rights to a computer object, in that article, all that was mentioned was that you can only see the plain text labs password. So labs is your local administrator management thing by Microsoft. So this all changed earlier this year when that blog post that I mentioned to you about showed how you can use a computer object to gain access, basically escalate your privileges to that computer object, to the computer itself. Okay, so come back to this slide. Now what happens if we have a writable DECL here, right? Remember, you don't need to have domain admin rights anymore. Let's say if you have a writable DECL here. Well, technically, you can, let's say what if also you had in control of another SPN. So technically, you could configure resource-based constraint delegation because you can write to the backend. But where are you going to find SPN, right? Just like that. So that's the relationship, right? So rogue SPN is the front end, web server is the back end. So where are you going to find a rogue SPN out of nowhere? Well, it turns out that, I think I missed the slide. Okay. Yeah. So if you can configure this relationship, you can do S4U to self, because like I said, you don't need that flag anymore. And if you can configure S4U to self, you can print a service ticket for the front end. Remember, the extensions are used on the front end, and then you can exchange that service ticket to access the web server on the back end. So where you're going to find a rogue SPN, it turns out that you can also create a SPNs by default. Any unprivileged user can create SPNs by default by using this thing called machine account quota. So this is a built-in design by Microsoft AD. Okay, so this is the property that you can see. Every unprivileged user can actually create up to 10 computer accounts, SPNs, by abusing this thing called machine account quota. So let's look at the attack in entirety. So if an adversary can write to the web server computer object and machine account quota is enabled, so he could create a rogue service by abusing MAQ, machine account quota. Then you can configure resource-based delegation between the rogue SPN and the web server. Then you can do a S4 to self to basically create a service ticket for the rogue SPN, which you have in control. Then use S4 to proxy to exchange that ticket to get an administrator ticket for a web server. And so that's known as a S4U attack, and it's all built into Rubius. So worse still, if the domain is compromised, you can actually configure RBCD, resource-based constraint delegation, from the domain controller to a rogue SPN, and basically from there you can create golden tickets out of thin air. But basically, just generate on demand. So it's pretty serious. So here's how it all looks like. So I've configured, don't have to look at this. This is just the AD. Okay, so we are now in the unprivileged user. Okay, now we try to list the C drive from the web server. It's obviously not going to work, right? Because we're just a standard unprivileged user. So now we're going to check what properties we have over the web server. So it turns out that for some reason we have a generic write. So that means we can write to the web server computer object. So now we're going to create a rogue SPN by abusing machine access account quota, MAQ. So I created a machine account. So now you can see that it is not configured. There's no constraint delegation configured. So now we configured RBCD, and you can see, at first there isn't there. So now we've configured web server and rogue SPN to have a relationship, right? A constraint delegation relationship. So I'm just going to get the AES256 hash of the computer account that was created just now. Of course, you need that for Rubius later. And so that's the only command that you need. So we put in an AES256 hash, and that's it. We've just gained access to the web server. Now we can see the $C sign. So from here, you just have to do something like PSExec, and you've got console admin access to the web server. So let's talk about something even more confusing. You guys heard about NTRM relay? So what happens if you combine NTRM relay and RBCD? So it turns out that you can actually gain local privilege escalation on your own laptop as well, right? So as part of the blog post at the bottom, there are a couple of case studies. So these guys found out that if you change the account picture on your Windows 10 Server 2016 or 2019 Server 2019 machine, right? All you have to do is just change that account picture, and you could actually potentially gain local administrator access to your laptop or PC. So how does it work? Well, it turns out that whenever you change your account picture, I should skip this. It says here that the system, local system account, so that's anti-authority system, right? It opens the picture file to read its attributes. So what's the significance of the local system account? Right, so this is what it does. If I point it to a picture to another server, it tries to read attributes using the local anti-authority system. So the significance here is that the local service account, right, when it traverses the network, it presents the computer's credentials to the remote server. So if you've used Responder before, you would have seen something like this, something $sign. So $sign means that's the computer account. So by default, these computer accounts have the right to configure RBCD, resource-based constraint delegation. So how does it look like, right? So I'm just going to give a simple illustration of NTRM relay. So what is NTRM relay? It's basically it's a man-in-the-middle attack, right? So where credentials are intercepted and then it's used to execute commands on the target. So for this to happen, we have some assumptions first, right? So the adversary must be able to connect a rogue net device to the network or VM. So that rogue device must be able to communicate with both the victim and the target. So the target here is the domain controller. Victim is a Windows 10 machine. And it must be able to get the victim to send credentials to the rogue device. So on the target, LDAP signing must be disabled, if not it won't work. So you change the picture, you point it to a picture on a rogue device, on the rogue server, say I need a picture there. So the rogue device says, hey, I have the picture. So by design, Windows 10 sends the computer account credentials using system, right? So rogue server captures the computer account credentials, configures RBCD with LDAP. And that's how you basically capture it. So let's look at the entire attack in entirety. So Alice, she's got unprivileged access, as true most of us, okay? So she wants to get local admin to her own Windows 10 machine. So she first adds a rogue device to the network, right? Assuming that she can, yeah? And then she creates a rogue SPN by abusing MAQ. And then she adds a DNS record. Why DNS? Because by default, web clients can only authenticate automatically with hosts without any dots. So if you use an IP address, there's a dot in there, it won't automatically authenticate. So we add a DNS record. So now she changes the account picture. So same as before, captured, the rogue server captures the computer credentials. Then using NTRM relay, configures RBCD with LDAP. Then the rest is history, right? Do a S4U to self, exchange it, and then get an administrator ticket to the Windows 10 machine. That's the S4U attack. Okay? So let's look at how it's done. So that's the DNS. I'll just refresh it. There's no rogue device now. Okay, so this is the rogue server that has been added by Alice. So this is the bad guy. Yeah? So Alice tries to list her own $C$, her own C drive. It obviously doesn't work. So now she's in her own unprivileged standard enterprise, standard issue laptop. So she wants to gain local admin here. So okay, import all the modules first. So now she creates the SPN for it. Same as before. Now we'll create a DNS record to point it to the same IP that the rogue server is in, so 10.04. So this is the bad guy, very clear, right? Yeah. Okay, so now we're going to run the script to capture the computer credentials and automatically configure resource-based constraint delegation. So it's run already on the background. So now back to her own laptop. She's going to change the picture now. So we point it to the rogue server that she's added to the network, and that's all that's needed. So if you go back to the rogue server, you can see added MS allowed to act on behalf of other identity. So that's RBCD, it's been configured just like that. So now we're just going to double check that it's been configured on Alice's computer. So you can see rogue SPN is right there. Okay, so now we're just going to repeat the earlier steps. We get the AES-256 hash, and we're just going to get the service ticket, the administrator service ticket for this computer. So we go back to the rogue server and basically inject it into memory, and you can see it will work. Yep. So again from here, PSExec or some other variant, there's an open source variant out there, and you basically have local admin access from this rogue server. Okay, so summary. Unconstrained delegation. I'm not going to read everything. I think everybody blur already. So basically, Microsoft says, don't use it. Right? It's been around for ages. Don't use it. If you can disable the print spooler, just do it. If there's look up on that patch that's released recently. I think it's quite a big deal. So you can use this PowerShell command to find out unconstrained delegation servers. And if you use Bloodhound, there's actually a built-in analytic query as well. So for traditional constraint delegation, you can actually detect S4U to self and S4U to proxy. And one thing to take note of is that if you have that SE enabled delegation privilege, or if somebody that is not domain admin or enterprise admin and has that privilege, that should be a red flag by itself. So you can find servers using this PowerShell, and if you use Bloodhound, it's identified by this edge called allowed to delegate. Right, so for resource-based, you can actually detect resource-based delegation configuration changes if that event ID right there, 5136. So to prevent that local escalation privilege that I show you for the Windows 10 one, you can actually configure all computer objects to stop configuring RBCD by default. And best still, if RBCD is not used at all, might as well configure everyone to not be able to configure it. So then there's this domain persistent technique that I showed to you earlier. It can be identified as well, it can be detected with the event ID 4769. Yeah, so some of the use cases are there. So, okay, last slide. So before we even talk about worry about all this stuff, I think let's get the basics right first. Yeah, so we get our basics in place, right? NAC, network segregation, application whitelisting, SMB signing, and so on. So just get this all in place first. So for detection of what I just mentioned, well, first we got to understand what normal looks like. Right, so any raw, non-LSAS or non-authorized Kerberos traffic from port 88 should be already suspicious by default. Yeah, so typically port 88 traffic should only come from LSAS or some authorized processors. So have all visibility over all your Kerberos delegation and traffic in the network. So S4U to proxy is dangerous extension. Even Microsoft did mention it, it is dangerous and it should be protected and restricted as much as possible. And then finally, configure your privileged accounts to, there's a flag in there in your properties that you can change account is sensitive and cannot be delegated, or put it in protected users. But just a word of warning at the top, right? So computer objects should not be put in protected users, you might break things. So forward-looking statements, if you look at the blog post, there are other use cases that's probably even more complex, yeah? So there are other ways that you can get forced authentication to occur, right? So once you can do that, you're basically game over already, unless you have detection in place. And one thing to think about is that is machine account quota needed? Do you really need unprivileged users to add SPNs to the network by default? Yeah, probably not. Huh? Okay, so with that, that's it. The slides are there. There's a link. So in case you think I'm phishing you, I'm not. Yeah, so time for questions, if there is.
A lot of interest to download the deck, right? So I'm sure you have some burning questions.
There's a contact me link in that the URL as well.
Is it traceable?
Traceable, of course I can trace. I can see who it's from. Yeah. No, just kidding. Okay. Just feel free to approach me. I mean, I may not know everything. This took me a while to digest as well, but I thought it's pretty important because if you talk about persistence techniques, right? You know, in the past, if some organization is compromised, the first thing they do is reset the KRB TGT twice, right? So nowadays, with this kind of articles around, you know, the bad guy's not just gonna make it simple. They might use these techniques to configure persistence, and it's something that you probably wouldn't even think about. You know, well, who has configured resource-based delegation on my domain controller before? Probably won't think of this use case. Yeah. So, but nowadays, I think, I know people are getting more sophisticated.
Yeah. Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So how to make sure that we can cover at least some of the blind spots?
So, like I said, basics first. So I think with a lot of the basics in place, if you have your detection in place, you have people ready to respond to alerts and so on. I think that's one area that you don't have to worry so much already, right? Prevention, like I said, it can be quite noisy if you use your own. Let's say you create your own application like Rubius, right? So it's going to come from very weird hosts, for example. So if somebody like Alice, some strange person from HR system get compromised, and if you see that HR system generating port 88 traffic out of nowhere from some unknown process, that's a red flag by itself already. Yeah. So, but before that, to even run that suspicious binary, you would have to have application whitelisting disabled. So again, one of the most fundamental things is to enable application whitelisting so that the standard users can only run what's been allowed by the organization. Yeah, so it's always defense in depth. Yes.
Do you need a mic?
Probably not. So, the same question I wrote, you actually wrote at the bottom, so I'll just ask that. You say, is machine accountability needed? My question was, when would it be? And why would someone set that up?
I don't know.
Okay. Nice.
It's a built-in, yeah, firstly, it's a very strange design principle as well. When I first encountered it, I was also quite, oh, this is quite strange. Why would I need to create machines as unprivileged user? But strangely enough, it's a built-in AD configuration. It could be an oversight, I don't know. Yeah, yeah.